10 years ago, my family kicked me out with $50 in my pocket and called me an ugly dropout. Today, I showed up to my golden sister's luxury wedding as the pity invite. When her arrogant new husband pointed at me and asked if anyone knew who I was, I simply smiled and said more than you think. What they did not know was that I literally owned the building they were standing in, and I was about to cancel their entire future. I am Camille, 35 years old, and the secret founder and chief executive officer of a massive private equity firm. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The drive up to the Monarch Estate in Atlanta was a masterclass in irony. I sat in the back of my chauffeured black SUV, watching the sprawling manicured lawns and towering oak trees blur past the tinted windows. The thick, humid Georgia air was kept at bay by the climate control, but I could still feel the heavy, oppressive weight of returning to a world I had left behind. The Monarch Estate was the absolute crown jewel of the city, a place where the elite came to flaunt their wealth, secure their social standing, and pretend they were royalty. Crystal chandeliers glowed through the massive arched windows, casting warm golden light onto the circular driveway lined with luxury sports cars and expensive imports. It was the exact kind of place my family had always fantasized about, a physical manifestation of the status they craved more than oxygen. And here I was arriving not as an honored guest, but as the black sheep, the estranged daughter, the pity invite. 2 weeks earlier, a cheap paper envelope had arrived at my corporate office. Inside was a reception-only ticket to my younger sister Jada's wedding. There was no +1. There was no invitation to the rehearsal dinner or the ceremony itself. Just a badly printed card dictating that I was permitted to witness the after-party. It was a calculated insult, a stark reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. 10 years ago, my parents Vivian and Roland had literally thrown me out onto the street. I was 25, then struggling to find my footing, and they had demanded I co-sign a fraudulent high-interest loan to pay for Jada's out-of-state tuition. When I refused to ruin my credit and participate in their scam, the reaction was immediate and brutal. I still remember the sound of the front door slamming shut behind me in the pouring rain. They packed my bags in trash bags, shoved a crumpled $50 bill into my hand, and told me I was a selfish failure who would never amount to anything. They spent the next decade entirely absent from my life. They never saw me build my first business from the ground up. They never saw me negotiate my first $1 million acquisition. They never saw the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, or the moment my holding company became one of the most powerful private equity firms in the country. To them, I was still the dusty tomboy who worked retail, the heavy burden, the disappointment, who did not know how to perform for the cameras the way Jada did. My driver David brought the SUV to a smooth, silent stop at the front steps of the estate. He opened my door, offering a respectful nod. I stepped out into the evening air. I was dressed in a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown. It was entirely understated, devoid of the flashy logos or excessive sequins my family usually favored, but the meticulous craftsmanship was unmistakable to anyone who knew true luxury. The dress cost more than the average down payment on a house, yet it whispered rather than screamed. I walked up the grand marble steps toward the heavy oak doors. The tension in the air was palpable the second my heels clicked against the polished stone floor of the foyer. The reception was just beginning to hum with the sound of clinking glasses, bright laughter, and live string music. I took a deep, steadying breath, preparing myself to observe the spectacle. Before I could even reach the entrance of the grand ballroom, a hand clamped down hard on my wrist. The sharp acrylic manicured nails dug into my skin like talons. I was abruptly yanked backward and dragged into a secluded side corridor away from the glittering lights and the wandering event photographers. The heavy, suffocating scent of cheap floral perfume hit me instantly. It was my mother, Vivian. She looked exactly as I remembered, only more desperate and aged by her own bitterness. She was wearing a heavily beaded gown that looked uncomfortably tight, her hair styled in an elaborate updo that screamed new money trying too hard. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure panic and disgust. "What are you doing walking through the front doors?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that echoed in the narrow, shadowed hallway. "You are supposed to come through the side entrance with the vendors. I cannot believe you actually showed up looking like that." I glanced down at my immaculate designer gown, then back up to her flushed, angry face. "Looking like what exactly?" I asked, my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of the intimidation she expected. Like a complete afterthought, she snapped, her eyes raking over my unadorned silk dress with utter contempt. "You could have at least tried to put some effort into your appearance for your sister's big day. But no, you always have to look so plain and pathetic. You are embarrassing yourself, Camille." The sheer delusion of her critique was almost amusing. Vivian was completely blind to the reality standing right in front of her. She only understood wealth if it was dripping in fake rhinestones and loud brand names. The subtlety of real quiet power was entirely lost on her. "Listen to me very carefully," Vivian continued, stepping closer and jabbing a rigid finger into my shoulder. "I am laying down the rules for tonight, and you are going to follow them to the letter. You are assigned to table 32. It is in the very back, right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. You are going to sit there, you are going to keep your mouth shut, and you are not going to cause a scene." I remained entirely still, letting her exhaust her manufactured authority without giving her the satisfaction of a reaction. And most importantly, Vivian said, her eyes narrowing dangerously, "You are forbidden from speaking to Preston's family. Jada is marrying into a very wealthy, very respected white family tonight. They are established people. They have class. I will not have you wandering over there and running your mouth about whatever dead-end retail job you are working these days. You were an embarrassment at your high school graduation, looking like a dusty tomboy while Jada was prom queen. I will not let your failure rub off on her today. Do you understand me?" For a fraction of a second, the memory of that high school graduation flashed in my mind. I had worked 3 jobs to help pay the household bills, wearing a borrowed dress under my cheap gown, while Jada was paraded around in custom couture. My parents had left my ceremony early to take Jada dress shopping. The old Camille would have felt the familiar sting of hot tears. She would have argued, defended herself, or begged for a scrap of maternal affection. But the woman standing in this corridor was not that terrified girl anymore. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to explain that I could buy Preston's entire bloodline with the loose capital sitting in my checking account. Instead, I just smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just locked the cage from the inside. "Whatever you say, Mother," I replied, my voice smooth as glass. "I will stay right by the kitchen doors. I would not dream of ruining Jada's perfect illusion tonight." Vivian huffed, clearly unsettled by my lack of resistance, but too wrapped up in her own social anxiety to question it. "Good. Now get in there and stay out of sight until it is time to leave." She turned on her heel and marched back toward the ballroom, desperate to resume her role as the affluent mother of the bride. I waited a moment in the shadows of the corridor, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my silk gown. As I stepped out of the alcove, I caught the eye of the venue manager, a distinguished older gentleman named Charles, who was overseeing the waitstaff near the grand entrance. Charles had been employed by my hospitality group for 3 years. He knew exactly who I was. As I passed him, I did not say a single word. I simply slipped my hand into my clutch and discreetly flashed a solid black metal card. Charles's eyes widened fractionally. He immediately straightened his posture, giving me a subtle, deep bow of absolute respect that went entirely unnoticed by the oblivious guests swirling around us. The rules had been set. The stage was prepped. My family thought they had successfully shoved me into the dark corner of their glittering fairy tale. They thought I was the silent outcast, the tragic failure they could point to make themselves feel taller. As I crossed the threshold into the main hall, the opulence of the room washed over me. Tables were draped in heavy white silk, adorned with towering centerpieces of imported orchids and white roses. Waiters in crisp black tuxedos floated seamlessly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with hors d'oeuvres and crystal flutes of expensive champagne. The air buzzed with the practiced laughter of people desperate to prove their worth to one another. I moved silently along the perimeter, gliding past groups of extended family members who either did not recognize me or actively chose to look away. The isolation they tried to force upon me felt like a familiar coat, but this time it was my camouflage. I found table 32, exactly where my mother had promised, tucked away in the shadows near the bustling kitchen doors. I took my seat, adjusting my gown, and folded my hands neatly on the table. Let the games begin. I had barely been seated for 5 minutes before the peace was shattered. A woman in a tight blush pink dress marched up to my table. She had the unmistakable energy of a designated mean girl clutching a clipboard against her chest. I recognized her immediately as Keisha Jada's childhood best friend, a woman who had peaked in high school and never quite recovered. Keisha looked down her nose at me, her eyes sweeping over my dress with a distinct lack of comprehension. "Jada needs you in the bridal suite right now." She commanded, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "She said you need to come drop off your gift directly to her so it does not get lost with the important ones." It was a thinly veiled setup, a summons to the inner sanctum so the queen bee could put the peasant back in her place before the real festivities began. I could have declined. I could have pointed out that my hands were completely empty and I had brought absolutely nothing for them to unwrap. But refusing would ruin the trap I was carefully letting them build for themselves. I stood up, gracefully smoothing my silk skirt, and gestured for Keisha to lead the way. We navigated through a maze of gilded corridors. The Monarch estate was famous for its private quarters, specifically designed to make the bridal party feel like absolute royalty. Double mahogany doors marked the entrance to the master suite. Keisha shoved them open without knocking and stepped aside with a smug grin, waiting for me to walk into the slaughter. I stepped over the threshold, the heavy doors clicking shut behind me, sealing me inside. The suite was a massive expanse of white marble plush velvet seating and wall-to-wall mirrors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive hairspray and chilled champagne. Holding court in the center of the room was Jada. She was drowning in a $20,000 custom lace gown, an obnoxious explosion of tulle and hand-stitched crystals that looked incredibly heavy and entirely overdone. She was perched on a tufted chaise lounge like a monarch receiving subjects. Standing over her shoulder was my older brother Trey, nursing a glass of scotch. Seated on a nearby sofa, looking thoroughly miserable in a stiff tuxedo, was my father Roland. The second my heel touched the marble floor, the temperature in the room plummeted. The lively chatter snapped into a heavy, suffocating silence. All three of them turned to stare at me, their faces twisting into identical masks of absolute disdain. It was the same collective wall of hatred they had built against me 10 years ago, perfectly preserved. "Well," Trey broke the silence, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with a loud clinking of ice. "Look what the cat dragged in. Did you have to take the city bus to get here, Camille? Or did you manage to scrape together enough coins for a cab?" Trey had not changed a bit. He was still wearing a suit that did not quite fit his shoulders, still trying to project an aura of wealth he absolutely did not possess. He was the classic failing entrepreneur, the son who constantly drained my parents' bank accounts for business ventures that mysteriously crashed and burned every 6 months. Yet in this room he was treated like a king simply because he played along with the family delusion. "I did not take the bus, Trey," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "I managed to find my own way." Roland scoffed loudly, refusing to even look in my direction. He kept his eyes locked on his polished dress shoes, shaking his head with profound disgust. "I told Vivian it was a mistake to let her through those doors," he muttered, his deep voice scraping across the quiet room. "We invite her out of the goodness of our hearts, and she shows up looking like she just rolled out of bed. Completely disrespectful. She brings nothing but bad energy to this family." The sheer audacity of the statement was almost breathtaking. I was standing in a venue I owned, wearing a dress worth a small fortune, while my father, a man drowning in debt, criticized my aura. Jada let out a high-pitched theatrical sigh. She waved a perfectly manicured hand, her diamond engagement ring catching the harsh vanity lights. "Daddy, do not let her upset you," she said, her voice dripping with venom, masquerading as pity. "We knew she would be like this. She has always been bitter. It is hard for her to be in a room surrounded by actual success." Jada stood up, the heavy layers of tulle rustling aggressively as she stepped closer to me. She looked me up and down, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. So, Camille, where is this gift you supposedly brought me? Or did you just come to eat our food for free? I know things have been tight for you since you got kicked out. I met her gaze, directly refusing to break eye contact. The air between us was electric thick with 10 years of unspoken anger and unresolved betrayal. I did not bring a physical gift, Jada. I thought my presence would be a sufficient gesture of goodwill. Trey barked out a laugh, slamming his glass down on a side table. Goodwill. From you. That is rich. You do not even know what the word means. You turned your back on this family the second Jada needed your help with her college tuition. You let us struggle while you went off and did whatever it is you do. You have a lot of nerve showing your face here empty-handed. They were truly committed to the narrative. In their minds, my refusal to commit federal fraud by co-signing a bogus loan using my pristine credit was the ultimate betrayal. My refusal to be their sacrificial lamb was the crime that justified my excommunication. They had spent a decade convincing themselves that I was the villain, so they would not have to face their own reflection. You look beautiful, Jada, I said deliberately, ignoring Trey's outburst. The sudden compliment threw her off balance. She blinked, her cruel smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before she recovered her composure. Of course I do, she snapped, touching the intricate lace on her bodice. It is an exclusive designer piece, imported. Not that you would know anything about that. Preston wanted me to have the absolute best regardless of the price tag. That is what happens when you marry a man who actually provides, Camille. A man who has a future. Roland finally lifted his head, his eyes burning with a fiery resentment that had not dimmed in a decade. Jada is marrying into a very powerful family tonight, he stated, his tone a clear warning. Preston is a visionary. His tech company is expanding globally. They are in a different tax bracket, Camille. A different world. We are elevating this family's legacy. You are only here because Jada has a forgiving heart. Do not test our patience. One wrong word to his parents, one embarrassing comment from you and I will have security drag you out by your hair. Do you understand me? The irony of my father threatening me with my own security team was so potent I could practically taste it. I maintained my perfectly neutral expression, letting the silence stretch out, forcing them to sit in the heavy, uncomfortable weight of their own arrogance. I was absorbing every insult, logging every threat, and adding it to the mounting tab they were about to pay in full. I understand perfectly, Roland, I answered, dropping the title of Dad entirely. It felt foreign on my tongue anyway. I know exactly what kind of world Preston comes from. I promise you I have no intention of ruining your grand illusion tonight. Trey sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. See that you do not. Now get out of here. You are ruining the aesthetic of the bridal photos. Go back to your corner and stay there until the catering staff cleans up. I gave a slow, deliberate nod. Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked calmly toward the double mahogany doors. My heart was not racing, my palms were not sweating. I felt an absolute chilling clarity. They had handed me every weapon I needed entirely unprovoked. As I reached the door, I made a calculated move. I reached into my small silk clutch to retrieve a tissue, purposefully fumbling just enough to let my phone slide out and drop silently onto the plush rug right behind a large floral arrangement on the console table. The screen was dark, but the voice recording application I had activated in the hallway was capturing every single breath, every insult, and every secret spoken in that room. I stepped out of the suite and pulled the heavy doors shut behind me, leaving them alone with their venom, blissfully unaware that the clock was officially ticking on their destruction. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, sealing my family inside the bridal suite with their venom. I stood in the quiet, gilded corridor for a brief moment, letting the muffled sounds of Jada and Trey's arrogant laughter fade into the background. My phone, discreetly hidden in the folds of the floral arrangement on their console table, was silently recording every toxic word. I smoothed the skirt of my midnight blue silk gown and walked toward the grand atrium. The cocktail hour was a masterclass in aggressive wealth display. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm, golden glow, while a live jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in crisp tuxedos navigated through the crowd of Atlanta's elite, carrying silver trays loaded with caviar and imported champagne. I moved silently along the perimeter, an uninvited ghost haunting a party I technically owned. I approached a towering ice sculpture to grab a glass of champagne. Before my fingers could even touch the crystal stem, a man bumped hard into my shoulder. He smelled of expensive, overpowering cologne and cheap entitlement. He was tall, blonde, and wearing a custom tuxedo that screamed old money but lacked any actual taste. This was Preston the groom. He did not apologize. He did not even look me in the eye. Instead, he shoved his empty glass in my direction and snapped his fingers right in my face. "You there," he barked, his tone thick with lazy arrogance. "Take this and get me a Macallan neat. And find someone to mop up the condensation near the ice sculpture. Someone is going to slip in these designer shoes, and I am not paying for a lawsuit because the venue staff is incompetent." I looked at his outstretched hand, then slowly brought my gaze up to meet his eyes. I did not reach for the glass. "I am not on the payroll tonight," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. Preston blinked, clearly annoyed that a black woman he assumed was a waitress dared to speak back to him. He finally looked at my face, then raked his eyes over my designer gown, his brain struggling to process why a member of the catering staff was dressed better than his own mother. "Then what are you doing standing around staring at the guests?" he demanded, puffing out his chest. "Do you know who I am? I am the groom. I booked this place. I suggest you make yourself useful before I have my father-in-law speak to your manager." Before I could correct his delusion, the frantic clicking of high heels echoed across the marble floor. Jada rushed over, her face pale with absolute panic. She had left the bridal suite to do the rounds and had spotted me interacting with her prized catch. "Preston, sweetheart, there you are!" Jada gasped, grabbing his arm and trying to physically steer him away from me. "This venue staff is giving me an attitude," Preston complained, glaring at me. I asked for a simple drink and she gave me lip. "We are paying a fortune for this place, Jada." Jada looked like she was going to be sick. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the room to see if anyone was watching. She forced a painfully tight smile and turned to him. "Preston, baby." "She is not venue staff." Jada forced the words through gritted teeth, her voice dropping to an embarrassed whisper. "This is Camille, my sister." Preston froze. The annoyance vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a dark, condescending amusement. He looked me up and down again, this time, with an entirely different kind of disrespect. The shift in his demeanor was chilling. The infamous Camille Preston laughed, a sharp barking sound devoid of any genuine warmth. He did not offer his hand to shake. "Jada warned me about you. Do not worry, my family is quite used to dealing with charity cases." I did not flinch. I just stared at him, absorbing the sheer audacity of a man who thought he held the high ground while standing on my property. Before Jada could drag him away, Preston waved his hand in the air, signaling to an older white couple mingling near the bar. They approached with practiced, stiff postures. The man wore a tailored navy suit with a rigid posture, and the woman was draped in heavy pearls with an expression that suggested she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. These were Preston's parents, Harrison and Beatrice. "Mother, Dad, come meet the prodigal sister," Preston announced, his voice dripping with mockery. "This is Camille." Beatrice looked at me as if I were a stain on the pristine marble floor. Her eyes swept over my natural hair and my dark skin, her smile tightening into a thin, venomous line. "Oh," Beatrice breathed, clasping her hands together in mock sympathy. "Jada mentioned you might make an appearance tonight. It is so incredibly generous of her to extend an olive branch after everything you put her through. We understand you have had quite the troubled past. It must be overwhelming for you to be in a place like this." Harrison swirled the scotch in his glass, looking down his nose at me. "Yes, well, we believe in second chances. You are surprisingly articulate for someone from your background. Jada has polished herself up so nicely, it is easy to forget where she comes from. We were quite concerned when Preston said he was marrying into a family with such complicated roots. But Jada assured us you were the only bad apple in the bunch. The microaggressions hit exactly like I expected them to, heavily coded in racial bias and elitist classism. They were standing there completely convinced of their own superiority, insulting me to my face, while praising Jada for successfully assimilating into their world. Jada looked at the floor, too terrified of losing her wealthy in-laws to defend her own sister or even her own race. She just nodded along, complicit in her own degradation. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the angry reaction they were baiting me for. I just smiled, a terrifyingly graceful expression that made Beatrice shift uncomfortably. "It is fascinating how much you think you know about my roots, Harrison," I said, deliberately omitting any respectful titles. Beatrice gasped softly at my brazen use of his first name. "I assure you, my background is far more complex than the fairy tales Jada has been feeding you." I continued, my voice smooth and unbothered. "And I am quite accustomed to places exactly like this. In fact, I feel right at home." Preston scoffed, clearly irritated that his parents' intimidation tactics had completely bounced off me. He turned his attention to two of his groomsmen, Chase and Hunter, who had wandered over to see what the commotion was about. Preston decided it was time to establish his dominance the only way insecure men know how, by talking about money. "We are celebrating early tonight, boys," Preston bragged, raising his voice so it carried over the jazz music, ensuring I heard every single word. "My tech startup is closing the buyout next Thursday. 50 million. Cash." Chase whistled, clapping Preston on the shoulder. 50 million? Who is the buyer?" Preston smirked, locking his arrogant eyes directly onto mine. "Apex Holdings, the biggest private equity and venture capital giant on the East Coast. Their chief executive officer is notoriously ruthless. A total ghost. Nobody knows who really runs the board, but their acquisitions team is obsessed with my software. They are practically begging to acquire us." He took a step closer to me, his chest puffed out, breathing his expensive cologne into my personal space. "Once the ink dries on Thursday, I am going to do Roland a favor and wipe out Jada's family debts," Preston declared proudly. "It is pocket change to me. That is what real success looks like, Camille. Take notes. Maybe if you clean up your act, you can apply for an entry-level position at one of my new subsidiaries. We always need someone to answer the phones." I stood perfectly still, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne to hide the lethal smile spreading across my lips. "Apex Holdings, my company." I knew the name of Preston's highly touted startup, Vertex Solutions. I had personally reviewed the financial file just yesterday morning in my penthouse office. Preston's software was built on stolen, obsolete code. His company was severely over-leveraged, bleeding capital, and secretly facing total bankruptcy. My acquisitions team had not been begging to buy him. They had been auditing him, and they had already drafted the official rejection letter, which was sitting on my desk, waiting for my signature on Monday morning. Preston was completely broke. He was relying on this fabricated buyout to save his reputation, and relying on my family's fabricated dowry to save his life. I looked at this arrogant, condescending man, knowing I held the absolute power to vaporize his entire existence with a single phone call. "I wish you the exact success you deserve, Preston," I said, my tone dripping with an elegant, razor-sharp sincerity. "I have a very strong feeling Apex Holdings will give you precisely what you have earned." Preston laughed loudly, slapping Chase on the back, entirely convinced I was conceding defeat and bowing to his wealth. He turned his back on me, leading his parents and his groomsmen toward the grand ballroom to prepare for dinner. Jada shot me one last terrified glare before rushing after him, desperate to keep her fragile world intact. I watched them walk away, relishing the glorious ticking time bomb they had just handed me. I set my empty champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray and turned my back to the opulent crowd, walking slowly toward the shadowy, forgotten table by the kitchen doors. The trap was set. All I had to do now was retrieve my phone and listen to the match striking the fuse. I slipped away from the cocktail hour, while the jazz quartet played a lively, upbeat set, using the crowd's distraction to mask my departure. The gilded corridors leading back to the bridal suite were entirely deserted, as the catering staff was focused strictly on preparing the grand ballroom for the evening dinner service. My heels made no sound on the thick, luxurious carpet as I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped back into the opulent, mirrored room. My silk clutch sat exactly where I had left it, perfectly camouflaged behind the sprawling arrangement of white hydrangeas on the console table. I picked it up, feeling the slight, telling warmth of the battery through the fabric. The screen displayed 47 minutes of continuous recording. I stopped the capture, saved the audio file securely to my cloud drive, and slipped the phone into my pocket. I needed absolute privacy to listen. I bypassed the bustling main halls and found a secluded wrought iron balcony on the second floor that overlooked the estate's sprawling manicured gardens. The heavy Georgia night air wrapped around me thick with humidity and the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. I pulled a single wireless earbud from my clutch, placed it in my ear, and hit play. At first, there was only the rustling of heavy tulle fabric and the sharp clinking of ice against Trey's Scotch glass. Then came the heavy thud of the suite doors closing behind me. The polite, arrogant masks my family wore instantly evaporated, replaced by the vicious, frantic energy of cornered animals. Roland's voice cracked like a whip. He demanded to know if Vivian had secured my signature yet. Vivian sounded breathless, her voice tight with panic as she paced across the marble floor. She complained that I was being difficult, that I had shown up looking entirely too confident, and that she had not found the right moment to force the pen into my hand. Roland swore loudly, the sound of a glass shattering against a table echoing sharply through the recording. He shouted that the venue manager had just given him a 1-hour ultimatum. The final $100,000 bill for the estate rental and the catering service had bounced. Roland screamed that the bank had officially denied the third remortgage on his house. They were tapped out, maxed to the absolute limit. Every credit card, every favor, every hidden account was bone dry. The opulent display swirling downstairs was a complete facade built on illegal loans and suffocating debt. Then came the moment that made the blood freeze in my veins. Trey's voice cut through the shouting. He told his parents to lower their voices before the venue staff heard them. He reminded them with chilling clarity that if the bank audited their recent applications and realized they had been using my social security number for the past 5 years, they were all going straight to federal prison. My mind raced, slotting the pieces together with terrifying precision. 10 years ago, when they kicked me out into the rain, I had left behind old tax documents and my original social security card in my desperate haste to pack. They had not just kept those documents out of spite. They had weaponized my identity. They had opened shadow accounts, secured high-interest loans, and built dummy shell corporations entirely under my name. My pristine credit score, which I had fiercely protected and monitored under my new corporate holding structures, had somehow been bypassed using my childhood addresses and Roland's forged guarantor signatures. They had funded Jada's luxury lifestyle, Trey's spectacularly failed business ventures, and Vivian's country club dues right on my back. Vivian's voice trembled on the recording as she laid out her desperate, malicious plan. She said she had the documents ready in her purse. A full legal liability waiver, and a master loan guarantor agreement cleverly bound in custom white leather to look exactly like a traditional family registry guestbook. She planned to corner me at my table during the reception dinner, flank me with the wedding photographer, and force me to sign it under the guise of a traditional family blessing. That single signature would authorize the final massive fraudulent loan needed to cover their tracks and pay the venue before the police were called. They did not invite me out of a sudden surge of maternal guilt or sisterly affection. They invited me because they were drowning, and they needed their sacrificial lamb physically present to sign away her life so they could keep pretending to be rich. The sheer unadulterated evil of it took my breath away. It was not pity. It was a calculated predation. The recording continued, growing even darker. A sharp knock sounded on the suite door. Vivian and Roland hastily composed themselves, whispering fiercely to each other before leaving the room to handle the venue manager downstairs. Jada and Trey were left alone. The second the heavy door clicked shut, Jada burst into hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. Trey snapped at her to stop crying and fix her makeup, warning her that Preston's parents would notice her red eyes. But Jada could not stop. Her voice was high-pitched and thick with absolute dread. She confessed to Trey that she had snooped through Preston's briefcase 2 nights ago while he was sleeping. She saw the real financial statements for his tech startup Vertex Solutions. Preston's company was completely dead in the water. They had 0 active investors, their code was obsolete, and they were facing total undeniable bankruptcy. The $50 million buyout from Apex Holdings was a complete and utter lie, a desperate story Preston had fabricated to keep his creditors and his own arrogant parents from realizing he was a monumental failure. Trey sounded genuinely stunned. He asked why Preston was rushing to the altar if he was completely broke. Jada sobbed harder, her breathing ragged. She admitted that Vivian had pulled Preston aside a month ago and promised him a massive $10 million dowry injection from a secret family trust upon their legal marriage, a trust that absolutely did not exist. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, followed immediately by a surge of dark, triumphant adrenaline. Preston was marrying Jada solely to get his hands on the imaginary dowry to save his dying company. Jada was marrying Preston solely for his fake tech billionaire status to save our family from total destitution. It was a spectacular collision of fraud. 2 completely bankrupt, desperate families scamming each other at the altar with my stolen identity, acting as the fragile linchpin, keeping the entire house of cards from collapsing. I reached up and pulled the wireless earbud from my ear. The garden below was peaceful, a stark contrast to the absolute warfare waiting inside. The sheer magnitude of the power I held in my hands was intoxicating. I did not just have the ability to expose them, I had the ability to legally, financially, and socially obliterate them. The distant, elegant chime of crystal glasses ringing echoed from the ballroom, signaling that dinner service was officially beginning. I slipped my phone back into my silk clutch and took a deep, centering breath. It was time to take my assigned seat by the kitchen doors. I navigated back through the corridors and entered the grand ballroom just as the guests were finding their places. The room was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. I walked past the front tables reserved for Preston's arrogant family and made my way to the very back of the room. Table 32 was positioned horribly, exactly as promised. The constant swinging of the wooden kitchen doors created a draft, and the clattering of plates from the waitstaff made conversation nearly impossible. I sat down gracefully, unfolding my linen napkin and placing it in my lap. I watched the room with the keen eyes of a predator observing its prey. As the first course was served, I saw Vivian and Roland making their way through the tables. Vivian was clutching a white leather-bound book against her chest, her face plastered with a wide, aggressive smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. Roland trailed closely behind her, signaling the hired wedding photographer to follow them to my table. The trap was in motion. Vivian reached my table, stepping directly into my personal space. The photographer raised his camera, the bright flash ready to capture this manufactured moment of family unity. Camille's sweetheart. Vivian cooed loudly, ensuring the guests at the neighboring tables could hear her performance. "We are so incredibly glad you decided to come out of hiding to celebrate your sister. We have a special family registry book. Only the immediate family is signing it. We want you to be a part of Jada's blessed union. Just sign right here at the bottom." She slammed the white leather book onto the table in front of me, flipping it open to a page filled dense, tiny legal print. She shoved a gold fountain pen toward my hand, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. I did not take the pen. I did not look at the camera. I looked directly into Vivian's terrified eyes. "I am afraid my vision is terrible in this lighting, Vivian," I said smoothly, my voice carrying clearly over the clatter of the kitchen doors. "I make it a strict personal policy to never sign any document without having my corporate legal team review the fine print. You understand, do you not?" Vivian's fake smile shattered. The photographer lowered his camera, sensing the sudden hostile shift in the atmosphere. Roland stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the view of the other guests. He slammed his hand flat onto the table, leaning in so close I could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "Stop playing games and sign the book, Camille." Roland hissed, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "Do not make me call security and have you dragged out onto the street." You are ruining the aesthetic of this reception. Sign the paper. I leaned back in my chair, unbothered by his posturing. Feel free to call security, Roland. I am sure they would be fascinated to hear why you are trying to force me to sign a master loan guarantor agreement disguised as a guest book. Vivian gasped loudly, taking a stumbling step backward. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking ashen and hollow. Roland froze, his hand still planted on the table, his eyes widening in pure horror as he realized I knew exactly what they were attempting to do. Before either of them could formulate a lie to save themselves, the sharp screech of microphone feedback echoed through the grand ballroom. The crowd went quiet, turning their attention to the front of the room. Trey was standing on the main stage, holding a microphone, his face flushed with alcohol and unearned confidence. It was time for the toasts. Vivian and Roland exchanged a panicked look, realizing they could not cause a scene now without ruining the speeches. They backed away from my table, melting into the shadows to watch from a distance their fraud temporarily thwarted. Trey cleared his throat, raising his glass high into the air. He looked out over the sea of wealthy guests, puffing his chest out to impress Preston's parents, sitting in the front row. Family and friends, Trey began, his voice booming over the speakers. We are gathered here to celebrate the true success story of our bloodline. Jada has always been the golden light of this family. She is ambitious, beautiful, and she knows exactly how to build a legacy. He paused, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his face as he pointed a finger directly toward the back of the room, right at table 32. We all know not everyone in a family makes the right choices. Trey continued, the microphone amplifying his insults for hundreds of people to hear. We have our very own prodigal sister sitting in the back tonight, a college dropout who could not handle the pressure of success. Someone who chose the easy way out and turned her back on us. But Jada, you never let that drag you down. You rose above the failure. You are the only one who truly made it. Let us raise a glass to the bride. The crowd offered polite, uncomfortable applause. A few guests turned around in their seats, craning their necks to look at me sitting by the kitchen doors. I maintained my perfect posture, my expression completely unreadable. As Trey stepped down, Preston confidently took the stage. He adjusted his expensive tuxedo jacket and gripped the microphone, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He sought me out in the crowd, locking eyes with me from across the massive ballroom. Thank you, Trey, for those inspiring words, Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. I have to say, Jada's heart is so incredibly big. She even invited the family failure to witness what real, tangible success looks like. Preston laughed, a sharp, arrogant sound that encouraged his groomsmen to chuckle along with him. He pointed directly at me, ensuring everyone in Preston's wealthy white family knew exactly who I was. You all know her, Preston mocked loudly. She is the cautionary tale, the one who cleans up the messes while the rest of us build empires. But today is about looking forward, not backward. Today is about elite partnerships and $50 million futures. My family beamed with pride, reveling in my public humiliation. They thought they had finally broken me in front of hundreds of people. They thought they had won. I calmly placed my linen napkin on the table. I picked up my silk clutch. The time for quietly observing from the shadows was officially over. It was time to burn their entire fraudulent empire to ash. The sharp barking sound of Preston laughing echoed over the soft jazz music playing in the background. Ah, the infamous Camille, he said, his voice loud enough to turn a few heads at the nearby tables. Jada warned me about you. Do not worry, my family is quite used to dealing with charity cases. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to shrink under the weight of his perceived superiority. But I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical amusement. I looked at the man my sister was so desperate to marry. Preston was a textbook example of unearned confidence, standing in a rented tuxedo, insulting the owner of the estate while drinking champagne he could not actually afford. Jada stood frozen next to him. Her knuckles were white as she gripped her bridal bouquet, her eyes pleading with me to just take the abuse and stay quiet. She was terrified. Not of me, but of losing the wealthy white savior she believed Preston to be. Preston did not wait for my response. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers twice, gesturing to an older white couple standing by the ice sculpture. They turned in unison, moving toward us, with the synchronized, rigid posture of people who spent their entire lives looking down on others. These were his parents, Harrison and Beatrice. They wore their prejudice like expensive cologne, thick and impossible to ignore. Beatrice was draped in an obnoxious amount of pearls, her face pulled tight in a perpetual state of disapproval. Harrison walked with his shoulders thrown back, swirling a glass of scotch, as if he were inspecting his kingdom. "Mother, Dad, come meet the prodigal sister." Preston announced, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "This is Camille." Beatrice stopped 2 feet away from me. She did not extend her hand to greet me. Instead, she looked me up and down, her eyes lingering critically on my dark skin and my natural hair. She let out a soft, theatrical sigh, clasping her hands together against her chest, as if encountering a tragic charity project. "Oh my." Beatrice breathed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Jada mentioned you might make an appearance tonight. It is so incredibly generous of her to extend an olive branch after everything you put her through. We understand you have had quite the troubled past, dear. It must be very overwhelming for you to be in a place like this." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, letting her empty words land against a brick wall. Harrison chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Yes, well, we firmly believe in second chances," he added, his tone utterly patronizing. "I must say, Camille, you are surprisingly articulate for someone from your background. When Preston told us about Jada's troubled roots, we were quite concerned. But Jada has polished herself up so nicely, it is easy to forget where she comes from. She is a real credit to your people. She managed to scrub the ghetto right off." The sheer concentrated racism, masked as polite dinner conversation, was breathtaking. They were standing in the middle of a high society event, insulting my race, my background, and my intelligence directly to my face. And the most sickening part was not their blatant bigotry. It was my sister. Jada just stared at the marble floor, swallowing her pride and her dignity. She was allowing these people to degrade her own bloodline just so she could secure a seat at their table. She was completely complicit in her own humiliation. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the angry, explosive reaction they were desperately baiting me for. That would be playing their game, and I only play my own. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch out until it became physically uncomfortable for them. Beatrice shifted her weight, her fake smile faltering slightly under my unwavering gaze. "It is truly fascinating how much you think you know about my roots, Harrison," I said, deliberately dropping any respectful titles. My voice was smooth, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. Beatrice gasped softly, her hand flying to her pearls at my brazen use of his first name. "I assure you my background is far more complex than the fairy tales Jada has been feeding you." I continued, my gaze locking onto Beatrice until she was forced to look away. "And I am quite accustomed to places exactly like this. In fact, I feel right at home. I find that true wealth does not need to announce itself, Beatrice. It simply exists, a lesson that seems to have eluded some of us tonight." Harrison's face flushed a deep, angry red. Beatrice looked like she had just swallowed a lemon. They were entirely unequipped to handle a black woman who did not flinch, who did not cower, and who spoke to them with the dominant, effortless grace of someone entirely out of their league. They had expected a street fight. Instead, I gave them a corporate execution. Preston immediately stepped forward, trying to physically close the distance between us to intimidate me. His jaw was clenched, annoyed that his parents' intimidation tactics had bounced off me like water off a stone. He realized he needed to re-establish his dominance, and like all deeply insecure men, he decided the only way to do that was to weaponize his wallet. He signaled to his groomsmen standing nearby, preparing to launch into his grand illusion of a tech buyout, desperate to prove to everyone watching that he was the most powerful person in the room. Preston snapped his fingers again, catching the attention of 2 groomsmen hovering near the open bar. They jogged over like obedient lapdogs, their overly gelled hair and tailored suits identical down to the monogrammed cufflinks. I recognized the type instantly. They were fraternity brothers turned mid-level managers who clung to Preston simply because he paid for the bottle service. "Chase Hunter, get over here," Preston commanded. He wrapped a heavy arm around Jada's waist and pulled her tight against him. He projected his voice deliberately, making absolutely sure the sound carried over the lively jazz music directly to my ears. "I was just telling Jada's sister about the future. We have a lot to celebrate tonight, boys." Chase grinned, holding up his glass in a sloppy salute. "To Thursday, man, the big payday." Preston puffed out his chest, his posture swelling with aggressive, unearned pride. He looked right at me, his eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of someone about to deliver a killing blow. "That is right, $50 million. Cash. Vertex Solutions is officially being acquired next week, the buyout of the decade." He paused, letting the astronomical number hang in the heavy, humid air. Jada leaned into him, her smile wide and painfully desperate. I watched her breath hitch, her knuckles turning white around her bouquet. I could see the absolute terror flashing behind her eyes. She knew he was lying. She knew it because she was playing her own twisted game of deception, clinging to a fabricated safety net he was dangling in front of her. Beatrice and Harrison simply nodded in approving unison, basking in their son's manufactured glory. "50 million," Hunter echoed, playing his part perfectly. "Who is the buyer again? You have been so incredibly secretive about the details." Preston took a slow, theatrical sip of his drink, his gaze locked intensely onto mine. "Apex Holdings," he announced, dropping the name like a lead weight meant to crush me. "The biggest private equity and venture capital firm on the entire East Coast. They are an absolute fortress. Their chief executive officer is notoriously ruthless. A complete ghost in the industry. Nobody knows who actually runs the board, but their acquisitions team is completely obsessed with my software. They have been practically begging to acquire us for months." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I kept my face sculpted into a mask of polite blank interest while inside my mind, a symphony of corporate destruction began to play. Apex Holdings. My company. I knew the name of Preston's highly touted startup perfectly well, Vertex Solutions. I knew it because I had personally reviewed the financial file just yesterday morning while sitting at my mahogany desk in my penthouse office. Preston's software was not revolutionary. It was built on stolen, entirely obsolete code. His company was severely over-leveraged, bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate, and secretly facing total, undeniable bankruptcy. My acquisitions team had not been begging to buy him. They had been auditing him. My lead analysts had literally laughed at his pitch deck. They had already drafted the official rejection letter. It was currently sitting in my outbox, waiting for my final signature on Monday morning to be formally dispatched. Preston was completely broke. He was relying on this fabricated buyout to save his reputation, and relying on my family's fabricated dowry to save him from absolute financial ruin. But Preston was not finished. He stepped closer to me, bringing his smug face mere inches from mine. I could smell the stale alcohol on his breath mingling with his expensive cologne as he invaded my personal space. "Once the ink dries on Thursday, I am going to do your father a massive favor," Preston declared, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "I am going to wipe out Jada's family debts, clean the slate entirely. It is pocket change to me, really, but that is what real success looks like, Camille. You take care of your own." He looked me up and down one last time, a sneer twisting his features into something deeply ugly. "Take notes. Maybe if you clean up your act and learn some actual respect, you can apply for an entry-level position at one of my new subsidiaries. We always need someone to answer the phones and fetch the coffee for the executives." Chase and Hunter barked out a chorus of raucous laughter. Jada giggled nervously, her eyes darting frantically between me and Preston, utterly terrified that I might say something to ruin the illusion. She had no idea that the illusion was already dead and buried. I stood perfectly still. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. The bubbles danced on my tongue, crisp and cold. I looked at this arrogant, condescending man, knowing I held the absolute power to vaporize his entire existence with a single phone call. He was standing on my property, insulting my intelligence, and using my own company to flex a wealth he did not possess. "I wish you the exact success you deserve, Preston," I said. My tone was dripping with an elegant razor-sharp sincerity that made his mother shift uncomfortably. "I have a very strong feeling Apex Holdings will give you precisely what you have earned." Preston laughed loudly, slapping Chase on the back, entirely convinced I was conceding defeat and bowing to his supposed wealth. He turned his back on me, leading his parents and his groomsmen toward the grand ballroom to prepare for the dinner service. Jada shot me one last terrified glare before rushing after him, desperate to keep her fragile world intact. I watched them walk away, their silhouettes swallowed by the opulent crowd. The satisfaction humming in my veins was intoxicating. They had handed me the executioner's axe and asked me to swing it. I set my empty champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray and turned my back to the glittering room. It was time to slip away to a quiet place, retrieve my phone, and listen to the match striking the fuse. I navigated the gilded corridors away from the cocktail hour. The catering staff was a blur of motion rushing to finalize the dining room for the reception. I moved against the current, my eyes focused and my expression completely blank. The heavy mahogany doors to the master bridal suite were unguarded. I pushed them open and stepped inside. The room was entirely empty. The air smelled of souring champagne and panicked sweat, a sharp contrast to the expensive perfumes that had choked the space just an hour earlier. I walked straight to the console table. My silk clutch sat exactly where I had left it, perfectly camouflaged behind the sprawling arrangement of white hydrangeas. I picked it up, feeling the slight telling warmth of the battery through the fabric. The screen displayed 47 minutes of continuous recording. I stopped the capture, saved the audio file securely to my encrypted corporate cloud drive, and slipped the phone into my pocket. I needed absolute privacy to dissect the damage. I bypassed the bustling main halls and found a secluded wrought iron balcony on the second floor that overlooked the estate's sprawling manicured gardens. The heavy Georgia night air wrapped around me, thick with humidity and the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. I pulled a single wireless earbud from my clutch, placed it in my right ear, and hit play. At first, there was only the rustling of heavy tulle fabric and the sharp clinking of ice against a crystal glass. Then came the heavy thud of the suite doors closing behind me as I made my original exit. For 3 seconds, there was absolute dead silence on the recording. Then the explosion happened. The polite, arrogant masks my family wore instantly evaporated, replaced by the vicious, frantic energy of cornered animals. Roland's voice shattered the quiet. He sounded breathless, frantic, totally devoid of the smug patriarch persona he had projected just moments before. He cursed loudly, the sound of a heavy glass smashing against the marble floor ringing sharply through my earbud. "What is she doing here, Vivian?" Roland shouted, his deep voice cracking with absolute panic. "You said she was going to stay in the shadows. You said she was going to look like a peasant. She walked in here wearing a dress that costs more than my car. If Preston's parents start talking to her, if they ask her what she actually does for a living, we are completely finished." Vivian's voice was shrill, completely unhinged. "I did not invite her to mingle, Roland. We need her here. You know exactly why we need her physical presence in this building tonight. But I cannot control how she dresses. I do not know where she got that gown. Probably rented it to spite us. We just need to keep her away from the in-laws until the reception dinner." A loud, ugly, gasping sob cut through the audio. It was Jada. She was hyperventilating, the rustling of her $20,000 dress amplifying her panic. "You promised me this would be perfect," Jada wailed, her voice high-pitched and saturated with terror. "You promised me the venue was fully paid for." The event coordinator just cornered me in the hallway outside the bathroom. He said the final check bounced. $100,000, Daddy. It bounced. He said if he does not have a wire transfer confirmation by the time the speeches start, he is cutting the power to the ballroom and throwing everyone out onto the street. Preston will leave me. His parents will cancel the marriage. Trey's voice chimed in next, lacking any of the arrogant swagger he had displayed to my face. "Because the accounts are frozen, Jada. The bank flagged the primary transfer this morning." Roland let out a guttural sound of pure rage. I told you to keep this wedding under budget, Vivian. I told you we could not afford the Monarch estate. But no, you needed the custom imported lace. You needed the ceiling covered in white orchids. You needed to serve vintage champagne. You said Preston's old money parents would smell the poverty on us if we did not project extreme wealth. We had to match their energy. Roland Vivian screamed back at him, her heels clicking frantically as she paced the marble floor. Preston's mother asked for our country club membership details during our first dinner together. If they thought we were broke, they would have called off the engagement instantly. They do not marry into poverty. We had to prove we were their equals. We are broke, Vivian! Roland roared, his voice vibrating with absolute desperation. We have been completely bankrupt for 3 years. I have zero liquidity. My businesses are drowning in debt. I illegally remortgaged the house behind the primary lender's back to pay for this charade. I stood on the balcony, leaning against the cold stone railing, letting the cool breeze wash over my face. The sheer magnitude of the confession anchored me to the spot. Bankrupt. The entire display inside, the flowing champagne, the string quartet, the designer tuxedos, it was all a massive, glittering lie built on top of a federal crime. My father had committed blatant mortgage fraud to finance a party. Roland was not finished. He was completely losing his grip on reality. I forged the appraisal documents to secure that secondary mortgage, Vivian. I lied on the federal disclosure forms. If the venue manager reports that bounced check, if the primary bank investigates why my accounts are overdrawn by 6 figures, they will immediately see the fraudulent lien on the property. I am looking at 20 years in federal prison. Do you understand me? I am going to jail for a wedding reception. Trey tried to interject, attempting to calm Roland down, but Roland instantly turned his rage onto his golden son. And you, Trey, Roland spat. You were supposed to secure the bridge loan from your investors to cover the catering costs. Where is the money you promised? Trey let out a pathetic, humorless laugh. I have no investors, Dad. My tech consulting company folded 6 months ago. I am living out of my car and showering at the local gym. I have been dodging debt collectors for 3 weeks. The only reason I am wearing this tuxedo is because I stole it from a luxury department store in Buckhead. I have absolutely nothing to give you. The audio dissolved into a chaotic symphony of sobbing, shouting, and sheer panic. Jada was crying that her life was over. Vivian was hyperventilating about her social standing in the church community, and Roland was pacing like a caged animal facing the slaughterhouse. I closed my eyes, savoring the absolute desperation in their voices. The vindication tasted sweeter than any expensive champagne. They had kicked me out 10 years ago for refusing to participate in a minor financial scam. They had spent a decade looking down on me, calling me an ugly failure, a retail worker, a cautionary tale. They had used my supposed lack of success to prop up their own fragile egos, and all this time they were drowning in their own manufactured debt. They were suffocating under the crushing weight of their obsession with status. They were literal criminals wearing stolen suits and forged gowns, standing in a venue they could not afford, trying to impress a white family that secretly despised them. The contrast between my reality and their illusion was poetry. I owned the very building they were terrified of being kicked out of. I held the deed to the marble floors they were pacing on. The venue manager who had threatened them was on my payroll, executing the strict financial protocols I had personally designed for the estate. But the recording was not over. The sheer incompetence and illegality of their actions was only the foundation of the rot. I stood silently on the balcony. The music from the ballroom completely faded from my awareness as the audio file continued playing into my ear. I listened intently, knowing that the real reason they had mailed me that pity invite was about to be spoken aloud. The audio hissed softly in my right ear, a brief and hollow intermission in the chaos. Then Vivian took a ragged, shuddering breath. I could hear the rustle of her heavy beaded gown as she physically forced herself to stop pacing. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped an octave, shedding the hysterical panic and adopting a cold, venomous authority that I remembered all too well from my childhood. Pull yourself together, Roland. Vivian ordered, her tone flat and commanding. Stop acting like a coward. We are not going to federal prison and we are not losing this venue. We have the solution sitting right downstairs at table 32. Roland let out a bitter, exhausted scoff. What solution, Vivian? The bank froze the Vanguard account this morning. The underwriter flagged the application for identity verification because the requested limit was too high. We are completely locked out. We cannot access a single dime of that credit line until they get a physical verified signature on their liability waiver. A dark, sleazy chuckle echoed through the earpiece. It was Trey. He sounded entirely too comfortable with the gravity of the felonies they were discussing. That is exactly why Camille is here today, Dad Trey said, his voice slick with unearned arrogance. You think Mom mailed her that pity invite because she suddenly missed her long-lost daughter. Please, we brought the golden goose right to the slaughterhouse. I gripped the wrought iron railing of the balcony. The cool night air did nothing to chill the sudden blinding heat radiating through my veins. Trey proceeded to lay out the reality of my family's existence with terrifying precision. He reminded Roland and Jada of the night they threw me out into the rain 10 years ago. In my desperate, frantic rush to pack my life into garbage bags, I had accidentally left behind a small cardboard lockbox in the back of my closet. Inside that box was my original Social Security card, my birth certificate, and 3 years of old tax returns. For 5 years, they had kept those documents buried. But when Roland's businesses began to fail and Vivian refused to downgrade her extravagant lifestyle, Trey had an idea. He explained on the recording how he had used my old residential history and my stolen Social Security number to bypass the basic security questions at various financial institutions. Her credit is flawless, Trey bragged, the sound of ice clinking in his glass as he took a celebratory sip. Whatever she is doing out there in the real world, she pays her bills on time. Her score was a perfect 800. We bypassed the verification checks by tying the new shadow accounts to Dad's old property addresses. We built a parallel credit file right under her nose. We leveraged her identity to the absolute maximum. I closed my eyes, the sheer magnitude of the violation washing over me in suffocating waves. They had not just abandoned me. They had kept my ghost chained to their basement to finance their delusions. Every designer handbag Jada proudly flaunted on social media, every luxury car Trey leased, and subsequently crashed every country club brunch Vivian hosted to impress the Atlanta elite, it had all been charged to my stolen identity. They had been bleeding my name dry for half a decade. But why did you have to invite her today? Jada whined, her voice cutting through my realization like a rusted blade. She looks like a dusty peasant. She is ruining my entire aesthetic. Preston's mother looked at her like she was a stray dog. Shut up, Jada, Vivian snapped, her patience completely evaporating. Do you want Preston to find out you are broke? Do you want to go back to shopping at discount stores and clipping coupons? That peasant is the only thing standing between you and a life of absolute poverty. Vivian then outlined the trap, detailing a plot so devious and premeditated it made my blood run cold. She explained the legal hurdle blocking their salvation. The new Vanguard line of credit was for $250,000. It was more than enough to pay the venue manager the missing $100,000 and cover the massive arrears on Roland's secretly remortgaged house. But because of the unprecedented loan size, the bank's automated fraud system had triggered a manual hold. They demanded a physical signature on a specific liability waiver to release the funds. I bought a custom white leather binder yesterday, Vivian explained to the room, her voice vibrating with dark excitement. I carefully extracted the center pages and glued the bank's liability waiver directly into the binding. The waiver is printed in dense 4-point legal font. It looks exactly like a traditional guestbook registry. No one ever reads a guestbook at a wedding. Roland finally spoke up, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. And you think she will just sign it without looking? Camille was always too smart for her own good. She reads everything. She will not read this, Vivian insisted sharply. Because I am going to use the crowd against her. I will go to her table right as the salads are served. I will have the photographer flank her on the right. Roland, you will block her exit on the left. I will smile for the camera and tell her it is an exclusive family registry. A special blessing for the bride. Vivian let out a low, predatory hum. She will be so desperate to feel included, so terrified of making a public scene in front of Preston's wealthy white family, that she will just sign the paper to get us away from her table. She has always been a coward when it comes to public confrontation. Trey added the final damning piece to the puzzle. And my boy Desmond is waiting out back in his car right now. He has his official notary stamp. The second you get her signature, bring the book to the alley. Desmond stamps it. I scan the document as a high-quality digital file directly to the Vanguard automated portal. The underwriter's system clears the hold and the $250,000 line of credit unlocks instantly. We wire the venue manager his money, and we keep the rest to save the house. It is flawless. I stood in the shadows of the balcony, the sweet scent of jasmine suddenly making me feel violently ill. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it was breathtaking. This was not a family making a desperate mistake. This was an organized crime syndicate operating under the guise of holy matrimony. They were actively plotting to bind me to $250,000 in fraudulent debt, entirely ruining my financial future, just so they could keep pretending to be rich for a few more hours. They thought I was weak. They thought I was the same terrified 25-year-old girl who had cried in the rain when they locked the door on her. They were relying on my silence, my shame, and my deeply ingrained fear of causing a scene to execute the final stage of their heist. A dark, terrifyingly calm realization settled deep into my bones. My pity invite was never about cruelty or making me feel small. It was a calculated predatory ambush. I reached up and pressed my finger against my earbud, ensuring the audio continued to play. I needed to hear every single word. I needed to memorize the exact cadence of their treachery so I could replicate it when I burned their lives to the ground. But the recording was not over. The depths of the deception had not yet reached rock bottom. As I listened to the rapid, panicked breathing of my sister, the conversation in the bridal suite took a sudden, violent detour. The fraud, it turned out, was not a one-way street. I stood perfectly still, my eyes locked on the glittering lights of the ballroom windows as Jada began to confess a secret that would make this entire wedding the most spectacular collision of lies the city of Atlanta had ever seen. The recording crackled softly in my ear, the sound of Jada sobbing echoing against the marble walls of the bridal suite. Her rapid, shallow breathing was the sound of a woman watching her entire future disintegrate before her eyes. "Trey, you do not understand." Jada wept, her voice trembling so violently the audio distorted for a fraction of a second. "Preston is completely ruined. He has absolutely nothing." Trey let out a harsh, confused breath. "What are you talking about, Jada?" He just stood out there during cocktail hour and bragged to his fraternity brothers about a $50 million buyout. He said Apex Holdings was acquiring his tech startup next week. He said he was going to wipe out Dad's debts. "He is lying!" Jada shrieked, the panic tearing her vocal cords. "He is lying to his friends. He is lying to his parents, and he has been lying to me. I went through his leather briefcase 2 nights ago while he was passed out drunk in our hotel room. I opened his laptop tray. I saw the emails." Jada took a ragged gulp of air, spilling the darkest secret of the entire evening. "Vertex Solutions is dead. It is a complete black hole. His lead developers quit 3 months ago because their paychecks bounced. His corporate office lease is in default. He is facing multiple lawsuits from early-stage investors for gross mismanagement of funds. That buyout from Apex Holdings is a desperate fantasy he made up to keep his aggressive creditors and his arrogant father from realizing he is a monumental failure." I stood perfectly still on the balcony, staring out at the manicured hedges illuminated by the soft security lights. The sheer magnificent irony of it all washed over me like a tidal wave of pure adrenaline. Preston, the man who had snapped his fingers in my face, the man who had treated me like a peasant, was drowning in millions of dollars of corporate debt. He was a complete fraud, wearing a rented tuxedo and bragging about a buyout from my own company that I had personally killed just 24 hours ago. Trey sounded utterly bewildered on the recording. "If he is completely broke, then why the hell is he marrying you? Why are Harrison and Beatrice walking around out there acting like American royalty if their pockets are completely empty?" Why throw $250,000 wedding if neither side can actually pay for the catering? Because Mom promised them a dowry. Jada wailed, the sound of her collapsing onto a velvet sofa accompanying her confession. I gripped the wrought iron railing of the balcony, my perfectly manicured nails pressing hard against the cold metal. Jada confessed everything in a rush of terrified tears. She explained how Vivian, desperate to secure Preston as a son-in-law to elevate the family's social standing, had pulled Preston aside a month ago. Vivian had spun a masterful, elaborate lie. She told Preston that she controlled a highly secretive generational family trust fund established by a wealthy great-grandfather. Vivian promised Preston a massive $10 million cash injection directly into his failing tech startup, but only upon the legal finalization of the marriage. The pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying, brilliant clarity. Preston was not marrying Jada out of love. He was marrying her to get his hands on a $10 million black family trust fund to save his dying company and hide his failures from his elitist, racist parents. And Vivian had only promised him that imaginary $10 million because she believed Preston was about to receive a $50 million buyout from Apex Holdings. She assumed that once Preston got his massive payday, he would wipe out Roland's illegal mortgages and save our family from federal prison. It was a spectacular, catastrophic double scam. Two completely broke, desperate families locked in a Mexican standoff of fraud, both clinging to each other like anchors while tossing themselves into the abyss. They were two sinking ships, each convinced the other was a lifeboat. And the only actual tangible money in this entire chaotic equation was my flawless credit score. I was the sacrificial lamb. Vivian and Roland needed me to sign that fake guest book tonight to unlock a $250,000 Vanguard line of credit. They needed my stolen identity to pay the venue manager so the reception would not be shut down by the police. They needed the wedding to finish so the marriage certificate could be signed so Preston would think he was getting his $10 million so Vivian could keep praying for Preston's $50 million buyout. It was a glorious, idiotic Ouroboros of financial crimes, and I was the only thing standing between them and total, undeniable destruction. Harrison and Beatrice had stood in the grand atrium, dripping in pearls and fake superiority, insulting my skin color and calling my sister a credit to her race for assimilating into their world. They had looked down their noses at me, utterly convinced of their supreme genetic and financial dominance. They had no idea they were penniless beggars waiting for a handout from a fictional black trust fund. I reached up and pulled the wireless earbud from my ear, dropping it back into my silk clutch. The recording had ended. The heavy mahogany doors of the suite had opened on the audio, signaling Vivian and Roland returning from their panicked confrontation with the venue manager, ready to execute their final trap. I turned away from the balcony, the cool night breeze lifting the hem of my midnight blue gown. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger was a useless, messy emotion meant for people who lacked control. I felt something entirely different. I felt absolute supreme power. For 10 years, I had built my empire in silence. I had endured their insults, their rejection, and their cruel dismissal of my worth. They thought I was a retail worker. They thought I was an ugly dropout. They had invited me here tonight to literally sign away my financial freedom so they could drink vintage champagne and play dress-up with bigots. They wanted a signature. I was going to give them an execution. I navigated the quiet gilded corridors, back toward the grand ballroom. The heavy double doors were propped open, and the vibrant, lively sounds of the reception spilled out into the hallway. The waitstaff was busy pouring wine and setting down plates of filet mignon for the guests. The room was a sea of glittering gowns, tailored suits, and oblivious wealthy socialites, entirely unaware that the floor beneath them was about to give way. I walked past the front tables, ignoring the sharp, dismissive glare Beatrice shot me as I passed her line of sight. I kept my head high, my posture immaculate, my face a mask of elegant serenity. I made my way to the very back of the room, right to the edge of the swinging kitchen doors. Table 32 was exactly as I had left it. I sat down gracefully, unfolding my heavy linen napkin and placing it deliberately across my lap. I picked up my crystal water glass and took a slow centering sip. From across the massive ballroom, I saw them moving. Vivian and Roland were weaving through the tables, their faces plastered with wide, aggressive smiles designed for the cameras. Vivian was clutching the custom white leather binder against her chest like a shield. Roland was trailing slightly behind her, his massive frame rigid with tension, signaling the hired wedding photographer to follow them toward the back of the room. The ambush was in motion. They were coming for my signature. They were coming for their salvation. I sat perfectly still in the shadows of the kitchen doors, waiting for them to arrive. I smoothed my hand over my silk clutch, feeling the sharp rectangular edges of the fraudulent financial reports and the identity theft dossiers I had printed directly from my corporate security team earlier that morning. I was ready. The clatter of porcelain plates and the sharp scent of roasted garlic masked the opulent jazz music playing at the front of the ballroom. Table 32 was an absolute sensory nightmare. Every time a waiter rushed in or out of the swinging wooden kitchen doors, a hot draft of humid grease-scented air washed over my bare shoulders. My table was deliberately situated so far in the shadows that the grand crystal chandeliers barely reached it. I was surrounded by a few confused plus ones and a couple of lower-tier vendors who had been invited purely to fill the seat quota. None of them spoke to me. I simply sat there carving a piece of filet mignon with surgical precision, watching my parents navigate the sea of silk and diamonds. They were closing in. Vivian marched ahead, clutching the custom white leather binder tightly against her chest like a shield. Her smile was blinding, a rigid, aggressive stretching of her lips, meant entirely for the hired wedding photographer trailing a few steps behind her. Roland flanked her left side, his massive frame deliberately positioned to cut off any escape route I might look for. He was sweating slightly under the collar of his rented tuxedo, the sheer panic of their impending financial ruin seeping through his pores. "Camille, sweetheart," Vivian cooed, her voice pitched unnaturally loud so the wealthy guests at the adjacent tables could witness her performance. Her tone dripped with a sugary maternal affection that made my skin crawl. "We are just so incredibly glad you decided to come out of hiding to celebrate your sister today. We know it takes a lot of courage for you to be here." I set my silver fork down. I did not stand up. I looked at her with a blank, unbothered expression. Vivian thrust the white leather binder onto the table right next to my water glass. She flipped it open with practiced urgency. "We have a special family registry book," Vivian announced, signaling the photographer to step closer. The flash of the camera blinded me for a fraction of a second. "Only the immediate family is signing it. We want you to be a permanent part of Jada's blessed union. Just take the pen and sign right here at the very bottom." She shoved a heavy gold fountain pen toward my hand. I looked down at the open page. It was a masterpiece of deception. To anyone passing by, it looked like high-grade parchment meant for well wishes. But sitting this close, my trained corporate eyes instantly recognized the dense four-point legal font, perfectly glued into the binding. It was a master loan guarantor agreement. A $250,000 liability waiver staring me right in the face. They were literally trying to hand me the bill for my own humiliation. I did not reach for the pen. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "I am afraid my vision is terrible in this dim lighting." "Vivian," I said smoothly, my voice carrying a rich, resonant calm that immediately shattered the photographer's illusion of a happy family moment. "I make it a strict personal policy to never sign any document without having my corporate legal team review the fine print. You understand, do you not?" Vivian's blinding smile vanished instantly. The muscles in her jaw locked. The photographer lowered his camera, sensing the sudden hostile drop in the room's temperature. He awkwardly muttered an excuse and backed away to capture candid shots of other tables. The moment he was out of earshot, the polite facade completely disintegrated. Roland slammed his heavy hand flat onto the linen tablecloth, rattling my silverware. He leaned over me, his massive chest blocking the view of the rest of the ballroom. "Stop playing your childish games and sign the book." Camille Roland hissed, his voice a low, gravelly threat that vibrated with raw desperation. "Do not make me call security and have you dragged out into the alley like trash. You are ruining the aesthetic of this reception. Pick up the pen and sign the paper right now." I looked up at him, my expression utterly devoid of fear. I have spent the last 10 years dealing with ruthless billionaires and cutthroat venture capitalists. A desperate broke man in a stolen suit did not even register on my radar. Feel free to call security, Roland, I whispered back, matching his intensity with a lethal, icy calm. I am sure they would be fascinated to hear why you are trying to force me to sign a Vanguard line of credit liability waiver disguised as a guest book. Vivian gasped audibly, taking a stumbling step backward. Her hands flew to her mouth, the blood draining entirely from her face, leaving her looking ashen and hollowed out. Roland froze. His hand remained planted on the table, but his fingers twitched with sudden, unrestrained terror. His eyes widened as the realization hit him like a freight train. I knew exactly what they were attempting to do. Before either of them could formulate a lie to save themselves, before Roland could make good on his threat to physically remove me from the building, a sharp, piercing screech of microphone feedback echoed through the grand ballroom. The harsh noise cut through the jazz music and the clatter of plates. The crowd went quiet, turning their collective attention toward the front of the room. Vivian and Roland jerked their heads toward the main stage. They exchanged a panicked, trapped look. They realized they could not cause a scene now without ruining the very event they had committed federal fraud to fund. The speeches were beginning. Their heist was temporarily thwarted, but the real show was just getting started. Vivian and Roland scrambled backward, melting into the dim perimeter of the ballroom like roaches fleeing a sudden spotlight. They left the fraudulent guestbook sitting exposed next to my water glass. I calmly placed my silk clutch squarely on top of it, securing the physical evidence of their attempted felony. Trey stood at the center of the grand stage, bathed in a harsh, bright spotlight. He tapped the microphone twice, clearing his throat and flashing a rehearsed 100-watt smile to the crowd. He aggressively adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo. I stared at the dark fabric of his jacket, remembering his frantic confession on the audio recording. He was standing in front of hundreds of people, broadcasting absolute superiority while wearing a stolen suit from a luxury department store in Buckhead. Family, friends, and esteemed guests, Trey began, his voice booming over the state-of-the-art sound system. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a truly historic union. Two great families coming together to build an unstoppable future. He spent the first 5 minutes of his speech aggressively pandering to Preston's parents. Trey spoke directly to Harrison and Beatrice, sitting in the front row, praising their legacy, their business acumen, and their incredible generosity in welcoming Jada into their elite circle. It was a pathetic, subservient display. He was a desperate man begging for validation from people who secretly despised his entire bloodline. Harrison offered a stiff, condescending nod, while Beatrice offered a tight, polite smile that barely concealed her boredom. But tonight is really about my little sister Jada. Trey continued, his voice softening with a thick layer of manufactured emotion. Jada has always been the golden light of this family. She is ambitious, she is fiercely intelligent, and she knows exactly how to build a legacy that actually matters. Then Trey paused. He took a slow, theatrical sip of his champagne. His eyes scanned the massive ballroom, deliberately passing over the glittering front tables, the towering floral centerpieces, and the wealthy socialites. His gaze traveled all the way to the back of the room, locking directly onto the shadows by the swinging kitchen doors. He pointed a single accusatory finger right at table 32. We all know that the path to greatness is never easy, Trey announced, his tone shifting abruptly from celebratory to mocking. And unfortunately, not everyone in a family makes the right choices. We actually have our very own prodigal sister sitting with us tonight, tucked away in the back. A collective murmur rippled through the hundreds of guests. Chairs scraped loudly against the marble floor as people turned their heads, craning their necks to look at the woman sitting alone by the kitchen doors. I sat perfectly still under the crushing weight of their staring eyes. I did not shrink into my seat. I did not hide my face behind my hands. I kept my posture absolutely immaculate, looking right back at my brother with eyes like frozen glass. 10 years ago, Trey projected loudly, making sure every syllable landed with maximum public damage. She decided that the pressure of our family's excellence was just too much for her. She dropped out of college. She chose the easy way out. She walked away from her responsibilities and turned her back on us when things got tough. She proved that she could not handle the weight of success. The sheer monumental hypocrisy of his speech was a masterpiece. He was standing on a stage calling me a failure, while he was secretly living out of his car and showering at a public gym. He was calling me a dropout, while his parents were currently hiding in the shadows praying they could forge my signature to avoid a 20-year sentence in federal prison. I glanced at the head table. Jada was glowing. She sat next to Preston, soaking in the cruel comparison. She loved every single second of my public execution. Hearing me degraded in front of the Atlanta elite validated her entire fabricated existence. Preston leaned over and whispered something in her ear, a smug, satisfied smirk plastered across his face. He was entirely too pleased with the public humiliation of the black woman who had dared to speak back to him during the cocktail hour. But Jada Trey boomed, bringing the focus back to the bride and raising his voice to a triumphant crescendo. You never let that kind of toxic energy drag you down. You looked at that failure and you used it as motivation. You rose completely above it. You are the only true success story of this bloodline. You are the one who actually made it. Let us raise a glass to the bride and groom. The room erupted into polite, highly uncomfortable applause. The wealthy guests clapped tentatively, whispering to each other behind their manicured hands about the dramatic family baggage they had just been forced to witness. Preston's parents nodded approvingly, clearly satisfied that the troubled roots had been properly and publicly shamed, officially separating the bad apple from their new daughter-in-law. I watched a waitress pause near my table, casting a deeply sympathetic glance my way as she balanced a tray of empty glasses. I gave her a tiny, reassuring shake of my head. I did not need pity. I needed Trey to finish digging the grave. Every insult he hurled into the microphone was another nail in his own coffin. Trey raised his glass high, basking in the applause. He took a deep drink of his champagne, utterly convinced he had just delivered the greatest speech of his life. He stepped back from the microphone, clapping Preston on the shoulder as they exchanged a look of arrogant brotherhood. The crowd's applause began to die down, but the tension in the room remained thick and suffocating. The spotlight shifted. Preston stood up from his seat at the head table, buttoning his custom tuxedo jacket. He reached out and took the microphone from Trey's hand. The groom was ready to deliver his own toast, and based on the predatory glint in his eye, he was eager to finish the assassination my brother had just started. Preston adjusted the microphone stand, leaning into it with the practiced ease of a man who loved the sound of his own voice. The harsh spotlight caught the sleek lapels of his custom tuxedo, making him look every bit the successful tech founder he was pretending to be. He flashed a brilliant predatory smile at the audience, letting the silence stretch just long enough to command absolute attention. Thank you, Trey, for that beautiful introduction. Preston began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. He placed a hand over his heart in a gesture of mock humility. It is an incredible honor to stand here tonight. Jada and I are embarking on a journey of massive success, and it means the world to have so many of our esteemed friends, business partners, and family members here to witness the start of our empire. He turned to look at his parents sitting at the front table. Harrison and Beatrice raised their glasses in a silent, approving salute. Preston nodded back, validating their shared delusion of racial and financial superiority. Then his gaze swept across the room, bypassing the glittering centerpieces and the wealthy socialites, zooming straight past the dance floor until it locked entirely on me. I sat perfectly still at table 32. The swinging kitchen doors had finally stopped moving. Even the catering staff had paused to watch the spectacle unfolding on the stage. As Trey mentioned, building an empire requires surrounding yourself with the right kind of energy. Preston continued, his tone dripping with an arrogant, venomous charm. It requires cutting ties with dead weight. But my beautiful bride, Jada, she is just too kind for her own good. Her heart is so incredibly big. She is so fiercely loyal that she even invited the family failure to witness what real tangible success actually looks like. Preston pointed his microphone directly at me. Hundreds of heads swiveled in my direction. You all know her. Preston projected loudly, ensuring his voice reached every corner of the massive estate. You might have seen her hiding by the kitchen doors tonight. She is the cautionary tale, the one who cleans up the messes while the rest of us build the future. I suppose every successful family needs a baseline to measure themselves against. A stark reminder of what happens when you simply do not have what it takes to survive in the real world. A low collective chuckle rolled through the ballroom. It was a sickening sound. Some guests laughed out of genuine cruelty, eager to participate in the public shaming of an outsider. Others chuckled nervously, swept up in the social pressure of conforming to the groom's ruthless joke. Harrison and Beatrice let out sharp, approving laughs, delighted that the troubled roots of their new daughter-in-law were being so thoroughly pruned in front of their high society friends. Jada sat beside Preston, blushing with a grotesque mix of fake humility and absolute unadulterated triumph. She looked down at her lap, pretending to be bashful about her husband's aggressive praise, but I could see the vicious satisfaction radiating from her posture. She was drinking in my humiliation like it was vintage wine. Over in the shadowy perimeter of the room, Vivian and Roland stood frozen. They were beaming with pride at the public validation of their golden child, but I could also see the raw, underlying terror in their eyes. They knew Preston was poking a bear. They knew I held the unverified, unsigned liability waiver right next to my water glass. They desperately needed me to remain a compliant, broken victim just long enough for them to secure my signature. But their desire to see me degraded was far stronger than their survival instinct. They allowed the execution to continue, entirely convinced I was too weak to fight back. The tension in the ballroom was thick, heavy, and suffocating. The air felt charged with a strange, hostile electricity. Hundreds of wealthy, oblivious guests stared at me, waiting to see if the dusty peasant from the back table would crack under the pressure, run out the doors crying, or simply bow her head and accept her place at the bottom of the food chain. I did none of those things. I looked at Preston standing on my stage in my building, bragging about a buyout from my company to cover up his absolute financial ruin. I looked at Jada wearing a dress funded by federal fraud committed using my stolen identity. I looked at Vivian and Roland, the masterminds of a criminal syndicate masquerading as a loving family. They had laid all their cards on the table. They had fired their best shots. They had used every weapon in their pathetic, fabricated arsenal to tear me down in front of the Atlanta elite. And they had absolutely nothing left. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool, crisp air fill my lungs. The roaring noise of the crowd, the clinking of the crystal glasses, the arrogant laughter, it all faded into a sharp, clinical silence inside my mind. The time for quietly observing from the shadows was officially over. I reached out and picked up my heavy linen napkin. I folded it with meticulous precision edge to edge and placed it neatly next to my silver fork. I picked up my silk clutch, feeling the solid weight of the audio recording and the printed fraud reports secured inside. Finally, I grabbed the custom white leather binder, the fraudulent master loan guarantor agreement that was supposed to be their salvation, and tucked it firmly under my arm. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed my chair back. The wood scraped loudly against the marble floor, a sharp, abrasive sound that cut right through the lingering chuckles in the room. I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my midnight blue custom silk gown, standing tall and immaculate. The sudden movement caught the attention of the surrounding tables. The guests closest to the kitchen doors stopped laughing. Their smiles faltered as they looked up at me, sensing the immediate terrifying shift in my demeanor. I was no longer emitting the quiet, passive energy of an outcast. I was radiating the lethal, overwhelming gravity of an executioner stepping up to the block. I stepped away from table 32. I did not look at the ground. I locked my eyes directly onto Preston, who was still standing on the center stage with a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. I took my first step down the center aisle, walking with slow, deliberate, unbothered grace. The heavy gold-plated doors of the trap had swung shut, locking everyone inside. It was time to burn their beautiful, glittering lies entirely to the ground. I moved down the center aisle with the slow, measured pace of a predator who had just cornered its prey. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, a steady echoing countdown to their absolute destruction. As I passed the lavishly decorated tables, the mocking chuckles of the wealthy guests abruptly died in their throats. People instinctively leaned back in their chairs, physically parting to make way for the sheer suffocating gravity I was projecting. I walked past Harrison and Beatrice in the front row. The smug, racist superiority had melted completely off their faces, replaced by a deep, sudden confusion. They could sense the violent shift in the atmosphere. The power dynamic in the room was rapidly realigning itself, and it was no longer pointing toward the groom. Over in the shadows near the bar, Vivian and Roland stood completely paralyzed. My mother's hands fluttered near her throat, her eyes wide with a frantic, voiceless terror. My father looked like a man watching an avalanche barrel toward him, entirely unable to move. They knew what I was carrying under my arm. They knew their fraudulent safety net was marching straight into the spotlight. I reached the base of the grand stage. Preston finally realized I was not walking to the exit. I was coming for his microphone. His arrogant grin vanished instantly, replaced by a flash of ugly, entitled rage. He bounded down the short flight of stairs, stepping directly into my path to physically block me from ascending to the platform. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his height to intimidate me into submission. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" Preston demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper, meant only for my ears. "You have had your 15 minutes of attention. Turn around, walk out the back door, and do not ruin my wedding, or I will personally throw you into the street right now." I did not break my stride. I did not even look at his face. Before Preston could even raise his hand to grab my arm, a massive figure stepped out from the shadows beside the stage. It was Marcus, the head of security for the Monarch estate. Marcus was a highly trained former military contractor who had been on my personal corporate payroll for 4 years. He moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Marcus stepped directly between me and Preston, placing a massive, unyielding hand flat against Preston's chest. He shoved the groom backward with enough force to make Preston stumble and nearly trip over the bottom stair. "Sir, you will step back immediately," Marcus commanded, his deep voice echoing like thunder across the silent ballroom. "Do not approach her again." Preston was utterly bewildered. He looked at Marcus, his face flushing with a volatile mix of severe embarrassment and unhinged fury. "I rented this venue," Preston shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the security chief. "I am the groom. I am paying your salary. I order you to remove this woman from the premises immediately." Marcus did not flinch. He did not even blink at Preston's outburst. Marcus simply turned his body, bowed his head respectfully to me, and gestured toward the stairs with an open hand. "Go right ahead, ma'am." The collective gasp from the hundreds of guests sucked all the oxygen out of the massive room. The wealthy groom had just been manhandled by the venue's head of security, and the security chief had just bowed to the outcast sister in front of the entire Atlanta elite. Harrison and Beatrice shot up from their seats, their faces pale with shock and outrage. I ascended the carpeted stairs gracefully, my midnight blue silk gown trailing behind me like liquid glass. I walked right past Trey, who was standing frozen near the podium, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. I stepped up to Jada. She was trembling violently, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the bridal table. Her eyes darted wildly between me, Preston, and the silent crowd. I reached out and calmly took the microphone directly from the stand. I tapped the metal mesh once. The sharp, clear sound resonated through the vaulted ceiling. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. "It is wonderful to see everyone enjoying the Monarch estate," I said. My voice flowed through the state-of-the-art sound system, rich, cultured, and dripping with absolute authority. "It is a spectacular venue, is it not?" I turned my head slightly, looking directly down at my sister. The blinding spotlight illuminated the stark, absolute terror on her face. "I am glad you love the chandeliers, Jada. I picked them out myself when I bought this property 3 years ago." The silence in the room was so profound it was almost deafening. Then a massive wave of shocked whispers erupted from the tables. Jada stopped breathing entirely. Her jaw dropped, her eyes wide with a horrified, uncomprehending stare. She looked at the polished floors, the gilded walls, the crystal chandeliers, suddenly realizing she was standing inside my house. Before anyone could recover from the initial shockwave, Charles, the distinguished venue manager, walked briskly down the center aisle. He carried a heavy black leather-bound master ledger. He marched straight up the stairs, ignoring Preston completely, and handed the ledger directly to me with a deeply respectful nod. "Thank you, Charles," I said, opening the heavy book and placing it flat on the podium. I looked back out at the sea of wealthy guests, commanding their absolute attention. As the owner of this estate, I usually leave the day-to-day operations to my exceptional staff. But tonight, I felt compelled to personally intervene regarding a rather pressing administrative issue. I traced my finger down the open page of the ledger, my voice echoing coldly across the hushed room. "It appears that the lavish hospitality you are all currently enjoying has not actually been paid for. According to my financial records, the final invoice for this reception, totaling precisely $100,000, was due an hour ago. The check provided by the bride's parents completely bounced." The crowd erupted into loud, scandalized gasps. Harrison and Beatrice looked at each other in absolute horrified revulsion, physically pulling back from the table as if poverty were a contagious disease. Preston turned a sickly shade of gray, looking desperately at Jada for an explanation she could not provide. I closed the heavy ledger with a loud, definitive thud. "The policy of my estate is incredibly strict," I announced, staring directly into the shadows where Vivian and Roland were cowering. "If the balance is not settled immediately, the power to the ballroom is cut, the catering is halted, and the guests are escorted off the premises by armed security. And since the hosts of this wedding are completely bankrupt, I suggest everyone finish their champagne quickly." The absolute shock paralyzing the ballroom was a tangible, heavy force. I did not give anyone a single moment to catch their breath. I reached down to the podium and picked up the custom white leather binder my mother had tried to force on me. I also pulled the thick, heavy stack of financial dossiers and identity theft reports from my silk clutch. My corporate security team had worked flawlessly, binding the evidence of my family's felonies into neat, undeniable packages. I looked past the glowing centerpieces and focused my gaze on the dark perimeter of the room. Mom, Dad, Trey. "Step out of the shadows," I commanded, my voice slicing through the thick tension. "You wanted the spotlight so desperately tonight. You wanted to elevate your legacy. Come to the front of the room and stand before your esteemed guests. Let us share the stage." They did not move. Roland was rooted to the floor, his massive shoulders slumped in pure terror. Vivian was shaking so violently I could see the sequins on her gown rattling from 50 feet away. Marcus, my security chief, took a single deliberate step toward them. That was all the encouragement they needed. Trembling and utterly defeated, my parents shuffled out of the darkness and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the ballroom floor. Trey stood paralyzed near the edge of the stage, his arrogant smirk entirely erased, replaced by the pale, sickly look of a man facing the gallows. I looked down at the three of them. 10 years ago, you threw me out of your house into the pouring rain. You handed me a crumpled $50 bill and told me I was an ugly dropout. You said I lacked the intelligence and the drive to ever amount to a single thing in this world. I let the words hang in the air, allowing the wealthy crowd to absorb the sheer cruelty of my origin story. You spent the last decade telling your friends and your country club associates that I was a failure, a cautionary tale, the black sheep who could not handle the pressure of your supposedly flawless bloodline. I raised the stack of documents high into the air for everyone to see. Yet for the past 5 years, you have been using my social security number to fund this entire wedding and every single luxury you possess. The collective gasp from the audience was sharp and visceral. The word fraud was whispered across the tables like a spreading fire. I walked down the short flight of stairs, stepping directly onto the main floor. I approached the front tables where Preston's parents, Harrison and Beatrice, were sitting frozen in their chairs. "Beatrice, you mentioned earlier that you were concerned about Jada's troubled roots," I said smoothly, looking directly into her horrified eyes. I thought you might appreciate a comprehensive background check on the people you are welcoming into your family. I dropped a thick dossier directly onto Beatrice's pristine white china plate. I tossed another copy onto Harrison's lap and handed the rest of the stack to the surrounding guests, instructing them to pass the documents around. The front row of Atlanta's elite scrambled to open the files. Inside those folders is the undeniable forensic proof of massive identity theft and wire fraud, I announced, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear every detail. You will find the records of shadow credit accounts, dummy shell corporations, and illegal mortgages all opened using my stolen credentials. Trey, you used my pristine credit score to lease your luxury cars and fund your spectacular business failures. Mom, your country club dues and designer gowns were charged to accounts you opened under my name. And Dad, you illegally remortgaged your house behind the primary lender's back to pay for this very venue, completely bankrupting yourself in the process. Harrison's face turned a violent shade of purple as he read the bank statements. Beatrice covered her mouth with a trembling hand, looking at Vivian with an expression of absolute unadulterated revulsion. The elitist, racist superiority they had wielded against me was now turned entirely onto my parents. To high society snobs like Harrison and Beatrice, financial fraud and bankruptcy were the ultimate unforgivable sins. But I was not finished. I walked back toward the stage and picked up the custom white leather binder. You see, I was not invited tonight out of sisterly affection. I continued, my voice steady and completely merciless. I held the binder up and ripped the center pages right out of the spine. The sound of tearing paper echoed loudly through the microphone. I was invited because my family needed a physical signature. Inside this fake guest book is a Vanguard line of credit liability waiver. They planned to ambush me at my table, flank me with a photographer, and force me to sign away $250,000 to save them from going to federal prison. Jada let out a loud, hysterical sob from the bridal table. She buried her face in her hands, her $20,000 dress suddenly looking like a prison uniform. People began to murmur, pointing at Roland and Vivian. A few guests stood up, clearly disgusted, preparing to leave the crime scene. But I needed to drive the final nail into the coffin. I needed to ensure that no one in this room could ever doubt the absolute malice of my family's intentions. I needed them to hear it straight from the source. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I navigated to my encrypted cloud drive and pulled up the audio file I had recorded in the bridal suite. I walked over to the microphone stand, turned the volume on my phone all the way up, and held the speaker directly against the mic. Let us listen to the bride and her loving family discussing their master plan just an hour ago, I said softly. I hit play. The state-of-the-art sound system in the grand ballroom amplified the recording with terrifying clarity. Roland's desperate, angry voice boomed over the speakers, confessing to the mortgage fraud. Trey's slick, arrogant laughter filled the room as he bragged about bypassing the bank's security questions using my stolen identity. Vivian's shrill, commanding tone echoed off the crystal chandeliers as she explicitly detailed how she glued the liability waiver into the guest book, calling me a coward who would sign anything to avoid a public scene. The crowd listened in total horrified silence. The sheer predatory evil of their conversation was impossible to deny. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated, vicious heist targeting their own flesh and blood. I stopped the recording right as Vivian called me a peasant. I lowered my phone and looked at my mother. Vivian's knees completely gave out. The last remaining shred of her fabricated dignity shattered into a million pieces. She collapsed heavily into a gold Chiavari chair, her hands clutching her chest as she began to hyperventilate. Short, ragged gasps of air tore from her throat. Her elaborate updo was unraveling, and tears of absolute panic streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the women from her church and her country club. Every single one of them looked back at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. She was entirely ruined. Her social standing, her pristine reputation, the only things she valued in this world, were permanently incinerated. Trey had backed himself against the wall, shrinking away from the furious glares of the groomsmen he had been trying to impress all night. Roland stood paralyzed, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors. as if calculating his chances of outrunning the police. I stood victorious on the stage, the undisputed architect of their destruction. The identity theft had been exposed. The financial ruin was public knowledge. My family was completely neutralized. But there was still one person left in the room who needed to be handled. One person who had stood on this very stage and called me a cautionary tale. I turned my head slowly, locking my eyes onto the groom. It was time to deal with Preston. The echo of my mother's humiliating recorded voice faded into the high ceilings of the grand ballroom, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum. The wealthy guests were entirely paralyzed, their expensive champagne glasses suspended halfway to their mouths. The atmosphere had shifted from a high society wedding reception into the scene of a spectacular, catastrophic crime. I did not give the crowd a single moment to recover. I turned my attention away from the shattered remnants of my bloodline and locked eyes with the man sitting at the head of the bridal table. Preston was no longer the smug, arrogant prince of the evening. His carefully constructed facade of white old money superiority had violently imploded. His face was flushed a deep blotchy red, and sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, staining the stiff white collar of his custom tuxedo. He scrambled to his feet with such erratic force that he knocked his gold Chiavari chair backward. It crashed loudly against the marble floor, the sharp sound making several guests flinch. "You are a liar!" Preston screamed, pointing a shaking, desperate finger directly at me. "You are all a bunch of broke, lying scammers. I knew there was something wrong with your family." He spun around to face his parents sitting in the front row. Harrison and Beatrice looked completely horrified, physically recoiling in their seats, as if the poverty of my family might somehow be contagious. Preston held his hands up in a frantic plea for validation. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this, Mom, Dad. I swear to you. They tricked me. They lied about everything." Preston's voice cracked, rising an octave in pure panic. "But it does not matter. I do not need them. I do not need their money. I have my company. I have the Apex Holdings buyout. I am untouchable." I walked slowly toward the head table, my midnight blue silk gown gliding effortlessly across the floor. My head of security flanked me at a respectful distance, ensuring Preston did not try anything foolish as his fragile ego collapsed. "And Preston," I said, my voice carrying a rich, resonant calm that sliced right through his frantic shouting. "You asked if people knew me during the cocktail hour. I told you more than you think." Preston backed up until his waist hit the edge of the bridal table. He puffed out his chest desperately, trying to salvage his crumbling pride in front of his groomsmen. "You do not know anything about me," he spat, though his voice lacked its previous venom. "You are just a bitter, jealous retail worker trying to drag everyone down to your pathetic level. My software is revolutionary. Apex Holdings is wiring me $50 million next week. It is a guaranteed deal." I stopped walking when I was less than 5 feet away from him. I looked at Jada, who was currently curled in on herself, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. "I know that Jada looked through your leather briefcase 2 nights ago while you were passed out drunk in your hotel room," I said smoothly. The words hit Preston like a physical blow. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. "I know she read your emails, Preston. I know she saw the desperate notices from your creditors." Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at Jada, absolute betrayal and horror warring on his features. Jada just sobbed louder, unable to even look at the man she had planned to marry. "I know that Vertex Solutions is completely dead in the water." I continued projecting my voice so the entire room could hear the autopsy of his business. "I know your lead developers walked out 3 months ago because their paychecks bounced. I know your corporate office lease is in default. And I know you are facing multiple lawsuits from early-stage investors for gross mismanagement of funds." Harrison shot up from his seat in the front row, his face unhinged with fury. "Preston, what is she talking about?" he demanded, his wealthy composure entirely gone. "Are you facing bankruptcy? Is this true?" Preston held his hands out toward his father, trembling violently. "She is lying, Dad. She is just a crazy woman trying to ruin my life. Apex Holdings is buying me on Thursday, I promise you." I reached into my silk clutch one final time. My fingers traced the smooth, heavy edges of the solid black metal business card. I pulled it out and walked right up to the edge of the head table. I held the card up so the harsh stage lights caught the embossed silver lettering, letting the expensive metal gleam for everyone to see. Then I tossed it directly onto the white linen tablecloth right in front of him. "Read the card, Preston," I commanded, my voice echoing like a judge handing down a final sentence. Preston looked down. His eyes scanned the metal surface. His breath hitched audibly. He began to tremble, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to keep his knees from buckling beneath him. He looked from the card up to my face, his eyes wide with absolute hollow terror. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and finally looked down at the jagged rocks below. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings," I announced to the room. The crowd gasped loudly. The groomsman, who had been laughing at his jokes earlier, looked completely horrified, stepping away from the head table as if Preston were radioactive. "I am the ghost you have been bragging about all night. And my acquisitions team has not been begging to buy your worthless software. They have been auditing you." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless wheeze escaped. "My due diligence team spent the last month ripping your company apart," I explained, delivering the corporate execution with merciless precision. "Your intellectual property is built on stolen, entirely obsolete code. Your liabilities far exceed your assets. You are bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. My lead analysts literally laughed at your pitch deck." The official rejection letter was drafted yesterday afternoon. It is sitting on my mahogany desk right now, waiting for my signature on Monday morning. I leaned in closer, ensuring he felt the full suffocating weight of his failure. "As of this exact second, your $50 million buyout is permanently canceled." Preston collapsed heavily into his chair. He buried his face in his hands, completely broken. The arrogant, racist tech bro who had snapped his fingers in my face was entirely gone, replaced by a destitute fraud facing public ruin. I turned my back on him and faced the hundreds of guests who were hanging on to my every word. It was time to expose the ultimate poetic justice of the entire evening. It was time to reveal the double scam. "For those of you keeping score, let me explain why this beautiful wedding is actually happening," I announced, gesturing between my weeping sister and her broken groom. "My mother, Vivian, promised Preston a $10 million dowry from a highly secretive Black family trust upon the finalization of this marriage. A trust that absolutely does not exist." Beatrice let out a loud, strangled cry from the front row, clutching her pearls as if she were having a medical emergency. "Preston only married my sister to get his hands on an imaginary trust fund to save his bankrupt company from his arrogant father," I continued, stripping away the last remaining illusion in the room. "And Jada only married Preston to get her hands on an imaginary $50 million tech buyout to save our family from federal prison. They are two broke, desperate people who tried to use my stolen identity to scam each other at the altar. Neither of them has a single dime to their name." I turned back to look at Preston and Jada. They were both weeping, their glittering fairy tale reduced to a pile of toxic, illegal rubble. I offered them one final, terrifyingly graceful smile. "You are marrying into a bankrupt family, and you are bankrupt yourself," I told them, my voice ringing with total, unbothered victory. A match made in heaven. The absolute silence that had gripped the ballroom finally shattered. It did not break gracefully. It exploded into sheer, unadulterated pandemonium. The facade of high society etiquette vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by the primal, vicious reality of desperate people backed into a corner. Harrison was the first to react. His face was a mask of pure aristocratic rage. He lunged out of his seat, knocking over a crystal centerpiece that shattered into 100 pieces across the marble floor. He marched directly toward the shadows where Vivian and Roland were attempting to shrink away. "You filthy scammers!" Harrison roared, his voice cracking with fury. He pointed a shaking finger right between my father's eyes. "You thought you could trick my son into absorbing your massive debts. You set up a fraudulent marriage to leech off our family name. I will have my lawyers draft a lawsuit so fast your heads will spin. I will see both of you thrown into federal prison before the night is over." Beatrice was right behind him, completely abandoning her pearls and her polite superiority. She screamed at Vivian, calling her a manipulative con artist. Vivian just stood there hyperventilating and weeping, unable to formulate a single coherent defense. Her entire social climbing existence had been brutally dismantled in front of the exact people she worshipped. On the main stage, the scene was even more pathetic. Preston snapped out of his shock-induced paralysis. The realization that he was not getting a $10 million bailout hit him with crushing force. He turned his anger entirely onto Jada. He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her roughly. "Is it true?" Preston screamed, his voice thick with panic and betrayal. "Tell me right now, Jada. Is the trust fund a lie? Is there any money at all?" Jada could not even speak. She let out a guttural, wretched sob. Her knees gave out completely. She sank to the floor, her massive $20,000 custom lace gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She reached up with trembling hands, grabbing fistfuls of Preston's tuxedo pants. "Please, Preston, please do not leave me," Jada begged, her voice high-pitched and saturated with absolute terror. "I love you. We can figure this out. We can start over. Do not walk away from me." Preston looked down at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. "Start over with what?" he spat, kicking his leg free from her desperate grasp. "We are both totally broke. You are a fraud. I am calling off the wedding." Jada wailed, collapsing onto the stage, sobbing so violently her shoulders heaved. It was a spectacular, pathetic display of a golden child realizing her entire value had just plummeted to zero. But the most satisfying moment of the night was yet to come. Roland had been watching the venue manager, Charles, who was standing by the exit speaking quietly into a radio, likely signaling the local authorities regarding the bounced check and the fraudulent contracts. Roland's eyes darted wildly around the room until they locked onto me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The daughter he had kicked out 10 years ago, the woman he had called an ugly dropout, was the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings. I was not just rich. I was corporate royalty. I had the power to wipe away the $100,000 venue debt with a casual flick of my pen. Roland abandoned his pride entirely. He broke away from Harrison's screaming and rushed toward me. His heavy footsteps echoed as he crossed the floor. He stopped right in front of me, his chest heaving, his face covered in a sheen of cold sweat. Then my father did the unthinkable. He dropped heavily to his knees. The loud thud of his kneecaps hitting the polished marble sent a shockwave of fresh silence rippling through the immediate crowd. Roland, the proud, arrogant patriarch who had terrorized me my entire life, was kneeling at my feet in a rented tuxedo. "Camille, please," Roland begged, his voice cracking thick with tears and absolute desperation. "I am begging you. You have to help us. You are a chief executive officer. You have millions of dollars. 100,000 is nothing to you. It is pocket change. Just pay the venue manager. Please. If you do not pay him right now, he is going to call the police. I will go to jail for mortgage fraud. Vivian will go to jail for identity theft." He reached out, trying to grab the hem of my midnight blue silk gown. Marcus immediately stepped forward, his massive frame blocking Roland's reach, ensuring my father could not lay a single finger on my fabric. "Please, Camille," Roland sobbed, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "We are your family. You cannot just stand there and watch us go to prison. You have the power to fix this. Save us." Vivian threw herself onto the marble floor right next to Roland. Her heavy, beaded gown scraped against the polished stone, catching on the shards of the shattered crystal centerpiece. She did not care. The impenetrable shield of her high society pride had completely evaporated. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, weeping with such raw, ugly intensity that her false eyelashes began to peel away from her skin. She reached out her trembling fingers, swatting uselessly at the air just inches from my dress as Marcus held his ground, forming an unyielding human wall between us. "Camille, please." Vivian sobbed, her voice a shrill, suffocating gasp. "You cannot do this to your own mother. You cannot just leave us here to be arrested. We are blood. We are family. You have to forgive us. You have to save us." I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world. I looked at the man who had called me a failure, and the woman who had locked me out in the rain with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes. For 10 years, I had wondered what I would feel if I ever saw them brought to their absolute lowest point. I had wondered if I would feel a sudden surge of guilt or a lingering sense of familial loyalty, or even a fleeting moment of pity. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no sadness. There was only a cold, clinical emptiness. The immense power I held in that exact moment was absolute, and I wielded it with surgical precision. I met Vivian's terrified, pleading eyes. "Blood is what you bleed when you get cut," I said, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom with the finality of a judge bringing down a gavel. "And you cut me 10 years ago. I am just finally bleeding you out." Vivian let out a strangled, breathless choke, physically collapsing against Roland's chest. They both knew it was over. There would be no salvation. There would be no blank check to cover their crimes. I broke eye contact and turned my attention to Marcus. I gave him a single, deliberate nod. "Throw them all out," I commanded, my voice carrying effortlessly over the whimpering of my parents. "The venue is closed." Marcus immediately signaled the rest of the estate security team. Charles, the venue manager, stepped forward and loudly instructed the catering staff to begin clearing the tables, officially terminating the reception. The glittering illusion was officially dead. I turned my back on my family. I did not wait to watch the security guards haul Roland to his feet. I did not stay to watch Jada scream as Preston stormed out of the ballroom without her. I did not watch Trey try to slip out a side door only to be blocked by venue staff. I simply began my walk down the grand corridor, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the floorboards. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer stood open, letting in the thick, humid night air. As I crossed the threshold, a new sound began to cut through the quiet elegance of the estate gardens. Sirens. A chorus of high-pitched, wailing police sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder and more frantic with every passing second. The fraud reports I had distributed to the wealthy guests had done exactly what they were meant to do. Someone in the crowd had called the authorities. The identity theft, the forged mortgage documents, the bounced checks, the entire criminal enterprise was crashing down on their heads all at once. I stepped out onto the front steps of the Monarch estate. My driver, David, was waiting beside my black SUV. He held the rear door open for me, his expression perfectly professional and unbothered by the approaching chaos. I slid into the plush leather seat, smoothing the silk of my gown one last time. David closed the door, sealing me inside the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of my vehicle. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the center console. I did not look back at the grand estate. I did not turn my head to look through the rear window as 3 marked police cruisers sped past my SUV, their flashing red and blue lights illuminating the dark driveway as they rushed toward the ballroom doors. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my water, leaning back against the headrest. I had built my massive empire from the cold ashes they left me in. Now they were going to burn in theirs. The war was officially over, and I had won. The most profound takeaway from this story is that your worth is never defined by those who are intentionally blind to your potential. When toxic environments attempt to dictate your narrative, the most powerful response is not immediate retaliation or explosive anger. It is silent, relentless growth. Success built on unwavering authenticity and hard work will always outlast fragile empires constructed from fraud, manipulation, and elitism. Ultimately, the greatest revenge is simply becoming everything your doubters claimed you couldn't be, protecting your peace and letting the natural consequences of their own cruelty dismantle their world. Share your own journey of overcoming toxic environments in the comments below, and hit that like and subscribe button for more empowering stories of triumph and resilience.